So when someone says Augmentation Evoker is broken, this could mean a multitude of things. For a lot of people, Augmentation Evoker being broken comes down to the fact that, they're overkitted. They have a lot of ability and ways to be able to solve death. They have a cheat death. Something like that is why some people might think Augmentation Evoker is broken. Some people might be following along with the most recent log hook stuff and think that Augmentation Evoker has been broken like that. Like an average player who just has a damage meter might look at Augmentation Evoker and see them doing tank damage and think that they're broken in the sense of they don't do anything, and which is what we saw whenever Augmentation was released. And whenever Augmentation was released, pretty much everybody was going, don't look at details, look at the logs for accurate results for Augmentation Evoker. And so now what happens when the logs lie? And Augmentation is still broken, but the logs are lying to people. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. Is Augmentation is an incredibly broken specialization to the point where it's broken in the sense of it's overpowered. It's broken in the sense of it's overpowered and people don't know it. And it's also broken in the sense of logs are completely wrong with how the spec is functionally working right now. And I mean, whenever you hear that they're broken in log hooks, you might think, oh, this is like a Warcraft logs issue. Why don't they just fix it in Warcraft logs? But it's actually a game issue. It's not like even something that Warcraft logs can fix. Whenever Aug came out, Blizzard basically told Warcraft logs, don't worry about it. We're going to provide log hook-ins to where you're able to correctly attribute how much damage is going to the Aug Evoker, should be at least attributed to the Aug Evoker. Now, that stuff's been broken, and these are like, there's a lot of stuff that we don't even know that's still broken. Like, there's stuff that's being found out each and every day that's still currently broken. Just to be very frank, we're going to kind of talk about it. I think that Augmentation Evoker, not to bash it too much, is actually a very interesting specialization. And I think that like support specs in WoW are kind of cool, right? I think that support, like the archetype in other games, I actually prefer playing support archetypes in other games generally, and I think it's quite cool. I just think that the implementation of how augmentation has worked with the current state of World of Warcraft does not coexist, and I think that this is probably something that's going to need a rework going into next expansion, just functionally how it works. Now, this isn't bashing on the people who play Aug Evoker, the people who like Aug Evoker. This is just going to be functionally talking about how Aug Evoker works and why it is broken, and it is so broken in like a game state sense as well. So augmentation, if you played it all last season, it was part of a Mythic Plus meta called God Comp. And there was also Mythic runs where people were running 16 of them, or like heroic runs where people were running 16 of them and insta-killing bosses and stuff like that. That stuff has kind of been curbed a little bit, and it's kind of been changed over time. But augmentation is still incredibly broken. And if you go actually look at Warcraft logs, after people were preached for a while to actually look at logs for how Aug is performing, augmentation is near dead last. Yet they were ran pretty heavily in the Race World First. And if you look at them in Mythic Plus logs, I mean, this is literally just a random log that I pulled off the front page of Warcraft logs. You can see right here that this spec is doing apparently replacement level tank damage, if you believe that to be true. Now, we're going to talk about the reasons that that's not true. And so first off, I think we're going to let Max kind of talk. There was an interview that Max did with Scripe, Roger Brown, and Mirez talking about the Race World First. And we're going to kind of listen and see what exactly he's talking about in regards to how you need to make sure that Aug is good and like what you actually need to be doing whenever you're doing tests for the specialization itself.
We did testing, and doing testing, like just as Aug hooks are broken now, ever since the 10.1.5, I think, PTR, Aug hooks they were perfectly fine at some point. I don't know what the fuck happened, but they stopped working entirely. So the only way to test this properly was to do like 2 exact raid comps against each other. So what you would do is you would do like, let's say whatever you think your best comp is with no Augmentation Evokers, just pretty close to what it is now with just a few more of the good classes added in. And then you would play 2 Aug, perfectly optimizing it. And that would be, every Ebb and Might window. And we had someone our raid do this raid. We called him the Augficer, which was Mavie. And his entire job, the whole raid, was just to make sure that Aug was buffing the perfect target at any point in time based on what was happening. And doing that, I'll just give you some rough numbers. I think the top DPS no Aug was right around 240k with Assassination Rogue and doing testing. And then Aug's value, the average Aug value of 2 of them buffing the best target every single time Ebb and Might was applied was, I think, 290 or 300k. So they were like 60k DPS single target ahead of the literal top DPS by swapping their buffs around.
Okay. So, and whenever you look at like damage done with how prescience works and with how ebb and might works, you would think that Aug Evoker is actually going to end up being quite good, just damage wise. But then there's a question as to why they're not good. Oh my gosh, flashbang myself. But and there's issues with reattribution of damage in the logs. And I mean, I'll link this down in the description so you can take a look at it and read exactly what it has to go through. But there's like a pretty large GitHub link talking about the attribution of damage from logs. The most important thing is that a lot of abilities just don't attribute properly to the Aug Evoker, where some abilities like Blade Flurry, like Shadow Blades, Dimensional Cinder, Lightning Rod, Earthquake, don't properly attribute the damage from the spec that it's getting buffed by Ebb and Might to the Aug Evoker. But I think something that's also incredibly, incredibly dangerous that people don't fully understand is that there are empty events where the damage is actually just going into the ether and it's actually not being attributed to anybody. The damage in logs is being dealt to the mob, but it's actually just kind of going away, right? So there's a question as to where the damage goes. And you can see these empty events and these empty support events actually shown on this link. And depending on how rampant these are, which they actually seem pretty prevalent, this is actually a big deal, and there's a lot of damage that's being lost by the Augmentation Evoker in logs that just, according to logs, goes out into the ether. Now, that's not how it works. Clearly, that's not how it works because you're actually just buffing players. But it is incredibly, incredibly stupid that that does happen. And so then whenever you go back and look at logs for how Aug is performing, you actually have no idea. And this actually happened in whenever they nerfed Aug. Okay, so this is the timeline. Whenever the screenshot was taken was before Augmentation Evoker got nerfed. So since then, Augmentation Evoker got around a 10% damage nerf, and this is like a guild that was on the PTR doing boss testing. They were doing damage numbers, and they were trying to figure out how good Aug was. So since then, Aug has gotten about a 9 to 10% damage nerf, and then they messed with Aug hooks, and then people expect you to believe Aug is down here. And so there's obviously something wrong if this is how good they were before a 10% damage nerf, and then this is allegedly how good they are after. Like there's clearly something wrong, right? And so that it's since then also the hooks have been updated, and they tried to fix some problems with them, but in doing so, they've actually created a lot more issues. And now you will see stuff like this occasionally, and where people actually believe that Augmentation Evoker, non-Aug Mythic Plus keys as well, we're going to talk about Mythic Plus pretty heavily too, non-Aug Mythic Plus keys are going to be faster than augmented Mythic Plus keys. And I think that this is just placebo, because you look at the damage meter, you look at the logs after the fact, and you get caught up in this thought process of, oh man, maybe Aug does suck. And this even happened to Scripe, Mirrors, and Roger. They were kind of talking about it, how they didn't do enough thorough testing, and so they actually ended up getting caught and lost up in looking at the numbers, and they thought that Aug was actually bad. Whereas you have to do A/B testing to even be able to check and to make sure that Aug is good. And funnily enough, even if you look at the top runs that are happening in Mythic Plus, pretty much all of them involve an Augmentation Evoker. Now, you could argue that it's because that the timers are so lenient that augmentation is good, but functionally, if you knew that a 3 DPS composition without Augmentation Evoker, even if you need the Aug for survivability at higher keys, you would kind of expect the no Aug keys to be able to outpace some of the keys that have the Aug Evoker. Now, this was the best run that I could find without an Aug Evoker. There was a group that was playing with Equinox, Jack, Carmezy, Norcom, and Quasi the other day, and they were playing non-Aug keys. And I also saw a group with it was JPC, Nerf, Ellesmere, Fu, and Azuna, I think was their fifth, and they were also playing no Aug keys. However, whenever you go back and look at not just their runs, but these are very impressive runs, but if you look at their times, this isn't the fastest fall, and it's not the fastest fall by a lot, right? The fastest fall has an Aug Evoker, and they were 4.5 minutes under. Now this run did have a decent amount of deaths. I want to say it had about 10 deaths, but at the same point, there is a run that has an Aug Evoker that is 4.5 minutes faster, and that kind of almost proves the point of these Aug keys are being done at the absolute highest level, and they're the fastest keys that are being done have an Aug Evoker. Whenever some people are saying that triple DPS is going to end up being faster, that's not just necessarily the truth. Again, for Mythic Plus though, this Mythic Plus season looks like it's shaping up to be something that's more defensive minded. And so on top of Augmentation Evoker being broken in the sense of you cannot tell how much damage they're doing, I think that is a major dilemma for the state of the game, because players need to be informed about how much damage stuff does. That is absolutely ridiculous that that's not fixed. But on top of that, Augmentation Evoker is broken in the sense of it gives your group an insane amount of utility and survivability that they otherwise are not going to have. And this is a major problem in Mythic Plus, because whenever it's played by like an average player, the spec is honestly quite bad. But whenever it's optimized and is put into good players' hands, and this happens in Raid and this happens in Mythic Plus, the spec does some insane stuff. The ability to be able to buff up your healers' survivability, and buff up the amount of healing that your group is doing. Blistering scales go on your tank, and your tank is also unkillable. And so then once both those two, like your healer is able to increase their throughput healing wise, your tank has increased survivability from blistering scales. Shifting sands gives versatility to your entire group. They also have things such as Black Atonement health gained whenever they press their defensive, which it's been nerfed a lot. It's now only 4% health gained to your entire party, but it's still something. They also have Rescue Shield. They can't die personally, like on a personal level, they cannot die. They also have a cheat death on top of that. The spec is obviously just going to be incredibly, incredibly broken for Mythic Plus unless something changes. Now, again, this is not anything against people who play Augmentation Evoker. I see some of the best players I know play Augmentation Evoker. Like the most skilled players can play Aug, and they perform incredibly well on it. But it's more of a problem of the spec is incredibly problematic because of the fact that, first off, you can't tell how much damage it's doing. I think that is a major dilemma. But how dominant it is going to be on both the Mythic Plus and the Raid metagame, where in Mythic Plus, it is near impossible to get rid of playing with an Aug Evoker. I think the only way that you get away from playing with an Aug is if it's actually doing as much damage as it's showing in logs. If it's replacement level with a tank, you would then get away from playing with an Augmentation Evoker, which is stupid. Like, if you're playing Aug, you don't want that. Anybody who's playing with an Augmentation Evoker also doesn't want that. Anybody who sees an Aug also doesn't want that. Like, it's a situation where they would have to nerf it to the point where it is unusable for it to not be brought to basically every single Mythic Plus run. And that's not cool. Like, there's a clear state where that's not fair to the augmentation and the people who play Augmentation Evoker. Like, that's something that absolutely has to change. And it's a spec that is going to be like completely dominated. Like, where top end players, if they're able to utilize it properly, the spec is going to be utterly broken for them, where it's going to be pretty average for mid-range players, or alternatively, they balance around it being good for the high-end players. And so then it's like average for high-end players and god awful for average players. That's not fair either. And so, like, I think that the AUG fundamentally needs a rework and a change with how it's designed. I mean, there's also a problem whenever you're presencing people and you're giving them crit. Like, you can't exactly tell how much crit you're giving. And this is more of an issue in 20-player content as opposed to 5-player content. But you're always going to want to be presciencing the correct target, which for an average Aug Evoker player, they're not going to be doing that, right? They're just going to let the prescience go where it may, and it's going to get put on the closest players to them. But, like, the good Aug Evoker players are going to be microing that prescience around and moving it to make sure that it's actually going on the correct people. Same with, like, Ebb and Might and stuff like that, where it's going to be going on the correct people each and every single time on cooldown and stuff like that. And that's, like, it's going to be problematic for average players. Max talked about it at length in this video as well. I'll probably link this down in the description so you can also take a look at the whole entire thing. This is not even just the scope of Aug Evoker, but like, but just as a whole, the spec is just so problematic. It's quite unfortunate because the support archetype of specializations is something that I actually think is quite cool. And I think it actually could have been well designed in Mythic Plus, just being able to buff up your players. But the way and the tools and the kit that they've provided to the Augmentation Evoker just makes it almost impossible to play without. And if it is so bad damage-wise that you wouldn't play without it, that means it's completely, utterly useless. And that's not fine either. Like, there shouldn't be specs in the game that are completely left in the dumpster for, expansions on end. Like they did with Demonology Warlock back in Warlords of Draenor. Like, that stuff should not happen in modern day WoW. At the same point, we shouldn't be locked into the exact same specialization every single season. And there's always going to be a meta for Mythic Plus. I think that you'll see people sometimes they'll complain about how one spec is locked in for Mythic Plus every single season. That's always going to happen. It always rotates. You see it every single season that there's going to be a rotating meta and rotating DPS. That's not going to change ever. Now, there is a problem when fundamentally Augmentation Evoker is so broken that it's going to be locked in for every single season. And that is a problem. And that's going to maintain an issue moving forward as well, unless something functionally changes with how Aug works. I think that they could actually probably change to do about 70% of their damage, and only 30% of their contribution could come from like Ebb and Might and Shifting Sands and stuff like that. Alternatively, they probably need to tune down their kit with just how much survivability they give to the remainder of their party, because that's way too high as it currently stands. I've also seen people talk time and time again about how it should not buff the tank and the healer for 5-man content, and I probably tend to agree, although that's not functionally why they're like super stupid and super OP. But I think that like they probably should buff, like as a support spec, you probably want to buff all of your party members in a 5-man group. That's like your bit, right? You're like a support spec. But like how it's currently designed is just not okay. And so that's why augmentation is broken. I hope that I was able to kind of get the thought process across very concisely. I know it was a bit rambly at times. I tried to keep it a bit more structured, but I hope to see you guys in the next video. I'm going to link some of the stuff down in the description as well, so you can take a look for yourself. And I will see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.